When our son Ben was about 4, I guess, he was just old enough to really start to pay attention to what was going on during the worship service and whatnot. I don't even remember if this was in Victoria or in Walton before that. We got down into the service and got to the invitation, and Luann noticed he was just sitting real attentive, real attentive. Got to the invitation. All right, good morning. It's good to see you this morning. In James chapter 1, you find this statement from the Apostle James, or from the writer James. In verse 2, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into manifold temptations, or when you meet various kinds of trials, knowing that the proving or the testing of your faith produces patience." Another word for that is steadfastness or consistency. "And let patience or steadfastness have its perfect work. Let it produce its full effect. Let it do its job, that you may be perfect." And that word perfect, Greek word teleos, means full grown, mature, complete, that you may be perfect, entire, whole, lacking nothing. This morning, and for the next several weeks, we're going to pursue a new theme for the next few weeks. This is kind of a divided quarter, 6 weeks before and 6 weeks after. And what we'll be talking about will fly under the heading of the proving of your faith. What tests your faith? Think about that for a minute. What tests, challenges your faith? Trial? But, trial is kind of like recyclables. One man's trash is another man's what? Treasure. What's a trial for Andrew here May not be an issue for Brian over here. But what's a real source of testing and intense challenging of faith for Emmett back here, that may not be anything for Wayne over here. Just like the saying that one man's trash is another man's treasure, we're all subject to trial. We're all subject to testing, temptation, challenges, but we don't all confront the same challenges, the same testing at the same time, in the same way, at the same level. But our faith is challenged, the proving of your faith. So think about what tests your faith. And for the next several weeks, we're going to try to touch several subjects that perhaps will be useful to us in dealing with that overall idea of the challenging or the testing of our faith. You know, these things work a whole lot better when you turn them on, don't they? Let's talk about vexation. Now, that's not a word that we use very much in the modern vocabulary. We tend in American English, we tend to go more toward words like aggravation or frustration or irritation, all those Asian words like vexation. But it's not a word that we use very commonly, is it? What would you say is the difference, if there is any, between being frustrated and being vexed, or being aggravated and being vexed, or being irritated and being vexed? Okay, would vexed be more confusing? It might be. What would you think? Or is there any real difference between being vexed and being irritated, frustrated, aggravated, annoyed? Okay, Jones suggests that vexation maybe goes to a deeper level and has more staying power, you might say. Go ahead, Dale. I can see you about to say something. Yep.
So vexation would be a spiritual trouble.
Okay, you're reading my notes now. Okay. There's a good distinction there. Dale says, and he points out Lot, back there in Genesis, living Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboiim, that area, the cities of the plain. Lot's righteous soul was vexed by the corruption, the sin that surrounded him. Whereas frustration, annoyance, irritation, that may be purely an emotional response in the moment. You get a splinter in your finger and you can't get hold of it to get it out, and every time you touch it, that can be a little bit frustrating until you can get hold of a needle or a pair of tweezers or something like that and work it out. That's not quite on the same level as being vexed in soul, is it? So in that respect, both Joan and Dale are kind of headed toward the biblical side of things, where vexation does in some respects get to a deeper level of involvement than merely aggravation or frustration, annoyance. You know, I can get really aggravated when I am working on an automobile, because if you take a nut off, what's going to happen to the nut? You're going to drop at least one nut when you work on an automobile, and where's it going to go? It's going, if it makes it all the way to the ground, sometimes it gets hung up somewhere in there and you have to hunt around with a light and a magnet and feel around and what have you. But if it makes it all the way to the ground, it's going to go to the exact geographic middle of the vehicle where you can't reach it from front, back, nor sides, and you have to crawl into the car to get it. That's annoying. And all you ladies are looking at me like, what? And all you guys are going, yeah, I get it. That's annoying. That's irritating. That's there's a saying that when you work on an automobile, you can't finish the job until the blood flows. You've got to skin at least one knuckle, or you just can't get the job done. Or if you do, something's not right. That's annoying, but that's not vexing. That's just an aggravation. Vexation goes deeper. 3 times in Psalm 37, we have this instruction, do not fret over evildoers. The very first verse, Psalm 37, fret not yourself because of evildoers, be not envious of wrongdoers. That sort of gets to what we see from time to time in the moments in the Old Testament particularly, where righteous people like Lot are being put to the test. They're being challenged. Well, are we trying to be righteous people? If we're Christians, trying to live consistent, faithful, committed Christian lives, shouldn't we be righteous people? And shouldn't we then have some level of uncomfort or distress or upset at the presence of evil and evil doing in our world? Now, it may go no farther in some respects than shaping our choices at the ballot box, or deciding whether or not to go ahead and call 911 when something suspicious in the neighborhood pops up. But it might go much farther to being personally involved in a family member's or a friend's or a neighbor's life and experiences and hardships or difficulties, trying to guide and encourage and what have you. Have you ever gotten involved enough in another person's life that their choices vexed your soul? Got kids? Got kids that have made stupid choices that you couldn't prevent? Do you care? You know what I mean then. Do you pray for your children? Sure you do. And do you pray for those children that make foolish choices? Choices that hurt you not because they do you financial or material or physical damage. We're not talking about a child who abuses a parent emotionally or physically or something. We're just talking about a child who makes choices that you can look down the road and see this is not going to end well. But it's out of your power to prevent it. Simply one example. Go back to Psalm 37. Notice again in verses 7 and 8, the admonition, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself, do not vex yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. That tells us that sometimes the person who chooses a vexatious way of life, a series of choices that you can see is foolish, hurtful, wrong, offensive to God, they don't necessarily run slap into a wall the minute that they make those choices. Now, we're all old enough here. We remember Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and how that, the Roadrunner just running down the road having fun. Wile E. Coyote is constantly trying to catch him and constantly being foiled. Runs right off the cliff out in the open air, and you see his feet just churning in midair. And he looks at you and goes, wide-eyed expression of astonishment, and down he goes. Well, that doesn't always happen the minute someone makes a foolish choice, does it? Go back to the book of Job for a minute. And what's one of the questions that Job asks indirectly of God? Let's back up a little bit. What is the book of Job really all about in one sense? The key assumption of Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar, along with Elihu, is that Job must have committed some horrible, horrible, atrocious sin, some enormous offense against God, that such suffering and hardship would come upon him. And of course, we know Job had done no such thing. He never contended that he was a flawless man, but he always says, I haven't done anything on this scale as you evaluate things. I'm not guilty of the kinds of things that you accuse me of. And the book of Job shows us the problem of evil and human suffering. And it shows us that human suffering is not the direct consequence of personal unrighteousness. Job's sufferings were not brought on by anything that Job did to deserve them, were they? In fact, we go back to Job chapters 1 and 2, and we see the contention, the discussion back and forth between God and the evil one. Have you considered my servant Job? What an upright man he is, perfect in all his ways. An exceptional character. And we see the accusation, why, he's only exceptional because you've so fenced him in that nothing can touch him. Let me touch him and he'll spit in your eye, so to speak. And of course, that does not happen. And yet here in Psalm 37 and verse 7, he comes back to this theme. Don't fret over evildoers, even the one who prospers in this existence. Go on to verse 8. Refrain from anger, forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. It tends only to evil. What happens when we are vexed, when we fret? What happens to us? When I was growing up, our neighbor across the street was a university professor in the local college. Generally speaking, a very nice guy, but come 4th of July or New Year's Eve, he almost had to get out of town because we teenage kids would be out in the street shooting off fireworks and bottle rockets and making all kinds of noise. And I didn't know until I was some years older that in 1966, when Charles Whitman climbed the tower at the University of Texas in Austin with a rifle and began shooting people on the quadrangle, Mr. Dare, my neighbor, was a student who was pinned down under a granite bench on that quadrangle being shot at. And so our shooting fireworks and things like that took him back to the sounds of that day. And it upset him terribly. He never said anything to us about it. I didn't know until years later, but it made him uncomfortable, to say the least. It upset him. He suffered from ulcers, stomach ulcers. He was a very high-stress individual anyway. We know now that stomach ulcers are actually caused by a little bacteria called H. pylori, and they're relatively simple to treat. We didn't know that in those days. And doctors would prescribe drink milk to calm this or what have you, and coat your stomach and so forth. But one of the things that medical types figured out long ago is that if you have this problem, what aggravates it? Stress. Things that would cause you to produce more acid and higher levels of, cortisol, I think, in your system and so forth. That just really aggravates the problem. Well, come 4th of July and 1st of the year, my poor neighbor, his stress must have been off the charts. And yet the psalmist says, refrain from anger, forsake wrath, fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. Now I don't want to draw any conclusion regarding my erstwhile neighbor in that respect. He was, in my experience, he was a nice man. But when we are vexed, like Lot, for example, what happens to everything else in our lives? Everything else in our lives kind of fades out to the borders, doesn't it? Because we're focused on what we're vexed about, what we're fretting about. There was I don't remember who the singer was, it was a woman, some of you probably could name her, a song on the country charts about 25 years ago, something about, I'm not ready to quit being mad. It's a husband and wife story. And she's telling him, you just go on. I know it's not your fault, but I'm not ready to quit being mad at you yet. I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm fretting, and I'm going to enjoy it a while. Something to that effect. Of course, none of us have ever experienced anything like that, have we? Well, it tends only to evil. If it's going to move you in any particular direction, it's not going to move you toward God. Fret not yourself. Don't be vexed. Now, Dale mentioned Lot a while ago. Take your Bible and turn over to 2 Peter chapter 2. When we go to the book of Genesis and we read about Lot there, what do we read about Lot? He's Abraham's nephew. Like Uncle Abraham, he's a herdsman. He has herds and flocks and servants to watch them and so forth. And he comes from Ur of the Chaldees all the way around the Fertile Crescent through Haran down into the Promised Land, settles in the Promised Land. And by that time, God has prospered not just Abraham, but Lot as well, to the point that they have enormous flocks. Now, I used to keep sheep. And at one point I had 20 some odd on about an acre and a half. That was the year that I discovered that sheep will gladly eat banana leaves off of banana trees, because I had banana trees out by the barn. And when it got down to the end of fall going into winter and all the vegetation had died off, they had mown down the pasture to bare dirt. Wasn't anything out there for them to eat. So I was having to buy feed. And I had these big banana trees that I didn't have, they'll come back next year. I don't need them dead and brown out there. So I started with a machete, started cutting sections off of them and throwing them over the fence. And boy, the sheep just had a field day. Gobbled them down, almost fought over them. But I had to pin those sheep up the next spring and keep them off that pasture for several weeks to give it time to recover because they had eaten everything in sight. I had the cleanest fence lines for about this far outside the fence. It was just bare dirt all the way around, and everything inside the fence was bare dirt. Lot and Abraham had so many sheep. That was just 20 sheep. They had so many herds and flocks that they were competing for pasturage. And we know how this turns out. Abraham says to Lot, hey, you want the hill country, I'll take the plains. You want the plains, I'll take the hill country. Lot looks at the fertile plains and I'll take the plains. Fine. And Abraham goes up the hill with his herds and flocks. Let's not have strife between us. Of course, that also is how Lot winds up in Sodom. And we look at Lot in the book of Genesis, and we tend to see him as kind of self-centered, sort of greedy in a sense. And he may have been all of those things. But we get over to 2 Peter chapter 2, and we learn something about Lot that we perhaps would never otherwise figure out, and that is in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7, he was a righteous man for all of that. He settled in Sodom, and it seems that he made, we would have to kind of read between the lines a little bit, but it seems that he made sort of a hasty choice, a hasty decision, didn't really look at the longer term consequences of his choice. I'll take these fertile plains down here. Flat land, easy to move the sheep from place to place, good grazing, all, from a material standpoint, everything's good. But where did he settle? Sodom. And what do we know about Sodom? No, it was the San Francisco and the Austin of the ancient world. Sodom was a place where perversion reigned supreme. How long did Lot live in Sodom? I don't know. Did he have babies before he went there? Little girls? Before he moved there? I don't know. But whether he already had children when he moved there or not, when he left there, he had a wife and 2 daughters. The wife doesn't make it far out of town. We've all heard too many times that joke about her driving, so to speak. But Lot and his daughters make it out of Sodom before the destruction arrives, take refuge in a cave. And what do Lot's daughters do? Oh, we've lost everything. We'll never have husbands and children and so forth. And one says to the other, tell you what, let's get Dad drunk. And they do. And he fathers 2 sons with his 2 daughters in his drunken stupor. Ammon and Moab, who will turn out to be thorns in the flesh, you might say, to their kinfolks, Abraham's descendants, the Israelites. Lot was not a perfect man. But Peter tells us Lot was a righteous man whose soul was vexed. Look at 2 Peter 2 and verse 7. Greatly distressed, the English Standard Version says, by the sexual, or sensual rather, by the sensual conduct of the wicked. God delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, according to the New King James Version. Now, we look at Lot in Sodom. He made that choice, he went there and then discovered apparently what kind of place he'd settled in to raise his kids in. Not a good choice. Didn't look far enough down the road. But then when God delivers him from that environment, what happens? Lot leaves Sodom. But some of Sodom, it seems, didn't leave his children, because they inveigle him into this scheme of theirs. They had to get him out of his senses to do it. Talk about your righteous soul being vexed. Here he'd been drawn into something that in his right mind he'd never have participated in. Imagine looking at these grandchildren as they're growing up and realizing on one level, these boys are the outcome, they're the outcome of a sin with my daughters by me. They're the outcome of my own allowing myself to be drunk. But then looking at them with their mothers, how could they even come up with such a scheme? Well, I put them in that environment. I made the choice for us to live in and be influenced by Sodom. Do you suppose Lot ever looked back with regret at that day that Abraham said, look, let's not have strife between your herdsmen and my herdsmen. You choose and I'll go the other way. You think he ever looked back and said, oh, I wish I'd gone up the hill? I expect he did. Don't vex your soul because of evildoers. Think about different examples of vexation, of frustration, aggravation, regret because of spiritual conditions. Turn over to Acts chapter 12, and there we notice that King Herod, now don't misunderstand, Herod's not the vexed one. He's the vexer, not the vexee. About that time, Acts 12 and verse 1, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. He killed James. What does it do to a congregation to lose a beloved, influential, not monetarily, but spiritually influential member? Think about Dorcas later on in the book of Acts, and the disciples come weeping and showing the garments that she had made. She had a profound impact. What does it do to a congregation to lose an influential member? Anybody here miss Larry Carroll? Sure. Larry used to sit right about where Andrew is. And if he was physically able, he was going to be here. Dressed to the nines, smile on his face, good nature, good humor, usually had a joke to tell, trying to lift up everybody else. And the guy was he's a young man, he's only 98. There's an empty spot, in a sense. It's like Jonathan says to David, you'll be missed because your seat will be empty. Well, there's an empty spot of sorts. You're welcome to it, brother. We're glad you're in it. But now, let's go one step farther. What effect does it have on a congregation when someone like that, someone who is influential in a positive, beneficial way, is taken away abruptly, untimely? Every year at the graduation in May, Georgia School of Preaching awards a scholarship in memory of a young man, Tate, who was a GSOP student and later a student at one of the universities, I forget if it was Freed-Hardeman or Faulkner. 18 years old, going out to little congregations that couldn't afford a preacher and preaching for them. He had finished the GSOP curriculum while he was still in high school. Killed in an automobile accident on a Sunday morning on his way to go preach. Do you think that left a hole, not just in the congregation where he grew up, but those little congregations where he served, where he preached? Now come back to Acts chapter 12. Herod reaches out, arrests, and effectively murders James, the apostle. And because the Jewish rulership approved, now he arrests Peter, throws him in jail, intends to execute him. Church has already suffered one blow, a martyr, James. And it looks like we're fixing to lose another one, Peter. We get down here to Acts chapter 12 and verse 4. Earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Do you think they were worried? I believe they were. Do you think their souls were vexed and distressed, knowing that this was an unrighteous act and that Peter had done nothing to deserve this? I believe they were. Earnest prayer was made. Smart move. Back in the Old Testament, when the Assyrians come pounding on the gates to Jerusalem in the days of King Hezekiah, and the Rabshakeh delivers a letter demanding basically unconditional surrender and submission, Hezekiah was upset. What did he do with the letter? That's right. He took it into the house of God and spread it out before the Lord and prayed earnestly. When you're vexed, when you're upset and distressed in soul and spirit because of sin, that's a smart move. Follow the example of the church. Look at Acts chapter 4 and chapter 16. You have the example of the early Christians in other things in which they're distressed. What happened to Peter and John in Acts chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3? You have them in the temple. You have the church growing. But in the meantime, the priests, the captain of the temple, or the ruler of the temple, the guy in charge of things, and the Sadducees were greatly annoyed that they were teaching the people and proclaiming Jesus and the resurrection. They arrested them and put them in custody. This is sort of a reverse vexation in a way. It's not the Christians so much as their opponents who were vexed or upset by what they're doing. Go over to Acts chapter 16. What happened to Paul and Silas in Acts chapter 16? We have these men, brothers in Christ, apostle and co-worker, in Philippi. And they wind up being falsely accused and arrested. Down here at verse 16, as we're going to the place of prayer, we're met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination, brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, and so on and so forth. And he finally casts out the spirit, and what happens? Her owners end up having Paul and Silas arrested unjustly. They were, again, sort of a reverse vexation in a sense, but Paul and Silas wind up in prison. Of course, the Lord opens a door. In fact, he shakes it open, and the Philippian jailer winds up being converted. Think about the days of Nehemiah and his enemies back there in the book of Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 1, chapters 1 and 2 tell us about Nehemiah's vexation, his distress. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king. He was a man of considerable influence and not just authority, but responsibility in the palace in Shushan. He was a man entrusted with the king's health in some respects. He was trusted by the king. But he receives word from brethren, his brother specifically, whether it's his brother in the flesh or his brother fellow Jew is not entirely clear. But he receives word that the captives or the returnees, the Jews who had been captives and had gone back to Jerusalem after Cyrus permitted them to leave, they've been there for all these years now, and they have not prospered. Things are not going well. They're losing ground. The city wall is not finished. The temple has been built, but things are not moving along as they ought to. And so in chapter 2, he comes into the king's presence, and the king is an intelligent man, sees that he's upset, vexed about something, and one thing leads to another, and finally the king sends him to Judah to be the governor, to get things on track and straightened out with the king's authority. But his vexation of soul, his distress showed in his face. You go on, and in his carrying out of his responsibilities, you find that even his enemies were vexed and upset by his success. Over in Job chapter 1, and I know our time is about up, but it's interesting to sort of put the shoe on the other foot. Have you considered my servant Job? You know, you can almost see God sort of smile to himself in this. What an upright man he is. What an exceptional servant he is. And you can just almost envision Satan grinding his teeth, and you see the little 11s between his brows, as it were, upset, angry. And what's he going to do? He's going to cause great vexation for Job in a way. The psalmist says, "Fret not thyself over evildoers. Don't let the power of evil have sway over you to the point that it can draw you away from God. What did Hezekiah do? What did Job do? There is a way to deal with this that keeps us in right standing with God. We need to keep our focus whenever we deal with those legitimately vexing, frustrating experiences in life. We'll stop there. Questions, comments, observations you want to make? We'll go on with a related topic next week. The proving of your faith produces patience. But you know what the scripture never says about that? It never says it's a fun process. Sometimes it's a challenge. Thanks for your attention.